Malcolm Ashworth had never worked a single day in his life without a driver waiting outside, a title on his door, and a name that opened every room before he even walked into it. So when his mother looked him dead in the eye and told him,
"You will spend the next 12 weeks wearing a security guard's uniform at the front doors of Ashworth Global,"
he thought she was testing him the way she always did. He didn't know she meant every word. He didn't know that within days, people who had spent their entire careers chasing her approval would walk past him without a second glance, snap their fingers at him like he was furniture, and treat him like he didn't matter at all. And he definitely didn't know that one woman, a woman with tired eyes, a grandmother to care for, and nothing left to prove to anybody, was about to see him in a way no one else in that building ever had. What Malcolm was searching for wasn't love. It wasn't a story to tell at the next board meeting either. He was searching for the truth about the people running his mother's empire. But the truth he found would end up costing someone their job, exposing a secret worth billions, and changing his life in ways money never could. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Nobody inside Ashworth Global thought twice about the young man standing by the glass doors every morning. To most employees, he was simply the security guard, the quiet man who greeted everyone with a smile, opened doors, and wished people a good day whether they answered him or not. Some ignored him completely, eyes fixed on their phones as they pushed through the revolving doors. Some barked orders at him without so much as a glance in his direction, and some treated him like he wasn't even there, stepping around him the way they might step around a potted plant in the lobby. But what none of them knew, not the executives who breezed past every morning, nor the interns who barely registered his existence, was that the man they dismissed so easily was worth more than every single person inside that building combined, salaries, bonuses, and stock options included. He was the only son of billionaire businesswoman Regina Ashworth, a woman whose name alone could silence a boardroom, and before 3 months had passed, one woman's kindness would change his life forever. Meanwhile, everyone who had mistreated him would be left wishing, quietly and painfully, that they could take back every careless word they had ever spoken to him. Because when Malcolm Ashworth disguised himself as a security guard, he wasn't looking for romance, and he certainly wasn't looking for revenge. He was searching for something his family's fortune had never been able to buy him, the truth about the people running his mother's company, the people who smiled in meetings and showed an entirely different face to those they believed didn't matter. It all started 3 months earlier, on an evening that Malcolm would later describe as the night his entire life quietly rearranged itself. Regina Ashworth had spent over 25 years building Ashworth Global, from a modest logistics firm into one of the most respected companies in Atlanta, with offices now reaching into New York and Los Angeles. People admired her intelligence. They respected the sharpness of her instincts. And more than a few feared the way her eyes could find a weakness in a proposal before the presenter had even finished speaking. But for all her success, for all the awards lining her office walls, and the profiles written about her in business magazines, there was one problem that kept Regina awake long after the city outside her window had gone quiet. Her son, 31-year-old Malcolm Ashworth, had grown up surrounded by comfort most people could only imagine. Private schools with manicured lawns, luxury cars waiting in circular driveways, vacations to places whose names most of her employees had never even heard spoken aloud. And yet, despite every advantage placed in front of him since birth, Malcolm had remained something Regina hadn't quite expected: grounded, thoughtful, and uncomfortable with the idea of simply inheriting something he hadn't earned. Still, she worried, because running a company the size of Ashworth Global wasn't only about quarterly earnings and shareholder confidence. It was about understanding people, understanding what made them show up exhausted and leave defeated. And Regina had spent enough sleepless nights wondering whether a boy raised in comfort could ever truly grasp what an employee felt clocking in at 6 in the morning after 3 hours of sleep. One evening, sitting in her office with the Atlanta skyline glowing gold and orange behind her, Regina made her son an offer he did not see coming. She had been turning the idea over for months, watching him move through the executive floors with polite confidence, shaking hands, nodding at reports, saying all the right things without ever really knowing what those reports meant to the people who produced them. She told him she had a challenge in mind, something that would test him in ways his business degree from an expensive university never could. Malcolm smiled easily, assuming she meant a struggling department that needed fixing, or perhaps a new regional office she wanted him to launch from scratch. Instead, she told him he would spend the next 12 weeks working inside his own company, but not as an executive, and not as her son. He would work as a security guard, standing at the front entrance where Ashworth Global employees streamed in and out every single day. No one could know who he truly was. Not the receptionists, not the executives, not a single soul inside those glass doors. No special treatment, no expensive watches on his wrist, no company car waiting outside. He would start at the very bottom of the ladder his own mother had built, and he would learn, in a way no boardroom presentation ever could, what it felt like to be looked past and looked through. Malcolm sat quietly for a long moment, studying his mother's face for any hint that this was some elaborate joke designed to test his patience. There was none. Finally, after nearly a full minute of silence, he asked her simply when she wanted him to start. 3 weeks later, nobody who worked at Ashworth Global would have recognized him even if they had studied his face directly. His tailored suits, the ones cut specifically for his frame by a tailor his mother had used for 15 years, were replaced by a plain, slightly ill-fitting security uniform purchased from the same supplier used for every other guard in the building. His hair, once styled by an expensive barber near Buckhead, was cut shorter and plainer by a barber shop 2 neighborhoods over. His sedan, sleek and quiet, sat parked in a garage nearly 2 blocks from Ashworth Global, replaced each morning by an older, unremarkable car that blended into the flow of Atlanta traffic without drawing a single glance. And instead of stepping into the private executive elevator reserved for senior leadership, Malcolm now stood at the main entrance, holding the door open for employees who had no idea they were looking directly at the future of the very company that employed them. His first morning on the job was eye-opening in ways he genuinely hadn't anticipated, despite months of mentally preparing himself for the experience. Employees rushed past him without making eye contact, some clearly running late, others simply too absorbed in their phones to register another human being standing 3 feet away, holding a door open for them. Several people ignored his cheerful greeting entirely, offering not even a nod in return. One man, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Malcolm's entire uniform budget for the month, shoved an empty coffee cup into his hands without so much as a glance, muttering something about throwing it away before walking off toward the elevators without waiting for a response. Malcolm stood there for a moment, cup in hand, and simply smiled to himself. This, he reminded himself quietly, was exactly what he had come here to learn. As the days stretched into weeks, things grew steadily worse before they ever grew better. Employees blamed him personally when the elevator ran slow during the morning rush, as though he had any control over aging machinery buried somewhere in the building's infrastructure. One woman complained loudly to him because it was raining outside, her tone suggesting somehow the weather itself was a personal inconvenience he was responsible for correcting. Another man snapped at him for holding the door open too slowly, despite Malcolm holding it open the exact same way he had for the person directly ahead of him. And then there was Camille Ford, whose particular brand of casual cruelty Malcolm would come to recognize instantly within the first 2 weeks. Camille worked in marketing, and she considered herself, without a hint of self-doubt, one of the brightest and most promising stars at Ashworth Global. She was stylish in a way that seemed almost rehearsed, ambitious in a way that left little room for warmth, and acutely, constantly aware of exactly who mattered inside that building and who most certainly did not. Every single morning, without fail, she treated Malcolm as though he were beneath her notice entirely. She called him Door Guy, without ever bothering to look up from her phone screen, snapping her manicured fingers impatiently whenever she felt the door wasn't being held open quite long enough for her liking. Her friends, trailing behind her most mornings, would laugh at her comments, and Malcolm would simply open the door wider without a single word of complaint. He wasn't collecting these small cruelties to fuel some future act of revenge. He was learning, patiently and deliberately, exactly who people revealed themselves to be when they believed nobody of any real importance was watching them. Weeks passed in this quiet rhythm of observation, and then, on one particularly humid Tuesday morning, everything shifted. The city had been drenched overnight by a heavy summer storm that left the streets slick and the air thick with moisture, and employees rushed inside irritated, tracking rainwater across the polished marble floor of the lobby. Camille stormed through the entrance that morning, complaining loudly about her ruined hairstyle to no one in particular, shoving her dripping umbrella into Malcolm's hands without a single word of acknowledgement before disappearing toward the elevator bank. Minutes later, another employee scolded him sharply over a coffee order he had absolutely nothing to do with, apparently assuming that because he stood near the entrance, he was somehow responsible for the entire building's beverage service as well. By early afternoon, Malcolm hadn't eaten a single bite of food, quietly settling into the corner of the lobby where he usually sat during his brief lunch break, preparing once again to skip the meal entirely, as he had done more days than he cared to admit during these first difficult weeks. That was precisely when a warm, unfamiliar voice interrupted the quiet exhaustion settling over him, gently informing him that people worked considerably better when they actually ate something during the middle of the day. He looked up, and for the very first time since beginning this strange and difficult experiment, someone was smiling at him, not out of pity, not because they needed something from him, but because they genuinely, unmistakably noticed him standing there. Her name was Simone Bell. She held out half of her sandwich without the slightest hesitation, the gesture so natural it barely registered as generosity in her own mind. She sat down beside him rather than across from him, closing the physical distance that so many others in that building seemed determined to maintain, and introduced herself as though he mattered every bit as much as anyone else walking through those glass doors each morning. Neither of them realized it in that quiet, unremarkable moment, but the simple act of sharing half a sandwich in the corner of a marble lobby was about to change both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Because while everyone else inside that building saw only a security guard standing dutifully by the entrance, Simone Bell saw a human being, fully and completely, and Malcolm Ashworth would never, for the rest of his life, forget the way that recognition felt settling into his chest for the very first time. From that day forward, Simone made it a quiet habit to greet Malcolm every single morning, regardless of how packed her schedule looked or how many meetings awaited her upstairs. It didn't matter if she was rushing toward a 9 o'clock presentation or juggling a stack of files nearly too tall for her arms to manage comfortably. She always paused, if only for a moment, to ask how his day was unfolding, to look him directly in the eyes, the way so few people in that building ever bothered to do. To Simone, Malcolm wasn't simply the man opening the door each morning. He was a person, complete with thoughts and feelings and a life that existed beyond his uniform, and that simple, consistent kindness stood out sharply inside a building where most employees moved too quickly to notice anyone positioned beneath their own rung of the ladder. Over the weeks that followed, Malcolm found himself looking forward to seeing her far more than he had anticipated when this entire experiment began. Some mornings she arrived carrying 2 coffees instead of 1, handing him the extra cup without making a production of the gesture. Other days she joked lightly about Atlanta's notoriously unpredictable traffic, or complained playfully about back-to-back meetings that seemed to multiply endlessly on her calendar. Their conversations remained simple on the surface, brief exchanges snatched between her obligations, but they quickly became, without either of them fully admitting it aloud, the best part of each day. What struck Malcolm most profoundly wasn't that she was kind specifically to him, it was that she extended this exact same warmth to absolutely everyone she encountered throughout the building. She greeted the janitorial staff by their first names, remembering small details about their families that most executives never bothered to learn in the first place. She thanked the front desk receptionist every single morning without exception, even on days when her own schedule was falling apart around her. She held elevators for complete strangers without a second thought, waiting those extra few seconds that so many others considered an unbearable inconvenience. And unlike so many of the executives who moved through Ashworth Global as though the building itself existed purely for their convenience, Simone never once seemed interested in impressing anyone at all, least of all the people whose opinions might have actually advanced her career. One particular afternoon, Malcolm noticed her struggling near the supply closet, attempting to carry several heavy boxes toward the main conference room ahead of an afternoon presentation. When he offered to help, she laughed and insisted she could manage perfectly well on her own, though she allowed him to carry 2 of the boxes anyway, falling into step beside him as they walked. As they arranged the supplies together inside the empty conference room, Malcolm found himself unable to stop noticing how effortlessly kind she seemed to be, how remarkably calm she remained inside a building saturated with quiet stress, unspoken competition, and the kind of office gossip that spread faster than any official memo ever could. Simone was different in a way that felt increasingly undeniable to him, and he was beginning to understand, piece by piece, exactly why that difference mattered so much. Not everyone inside Ashworth Global appreciated this quality about her, however. Camille Ford, in particular, seemed to take a strange satisfaction in making pointed comments whenever she caught Simone speaking with Malcolm near the lobby entrance. One afternoon, standing with a small cluster of co-workers just outside the break room, Camille rolled her eyes dramatically and remarked, loudly enough for several nearby employees to overhear, that Simone apparently spent more time with the security guard than she did with any of the actual executives on the floor. The small group around her laughed obligingly, the way people often laugh at comments they haven't fully considered. Simone remained entirely calm in response, telling Camille plainly that kindness didn't require a particular job title to justify itself, and Camille only smirked in return, replying that she personally maintained higher standards for where she chose to invest her time. As Camille walked away with her small entourage trailing behind her, Malcolm found himself admiring, quietly and completely, how gracefully Simone had absorbed the insult without wasting a single ounce of her energy defending herself against it. The more he observed her over these passing weeks, the more genuinely curious he became about her life beyond the walls of Ashworth Global, about what occupied her evenings and weekends once she walked out through those same glass doors he held open every morning. One evening, long after the majority of employees had already gone home and the lobby had settled into its familiar after-hours quiet, he finally received something resembling an answer to that curiosity. He saw Simone leaving the building that evening, carrying several heavy grocery bags, her posture betraying an exhaustion she rarely allowed to show during business hours. When he asked, gently, whether she was working late again, she laughed tiredly and admitted it felt like the ongoing story of her life at this point. Without thinking twice, Malcolm offered to help carry the bags to her car, and after a brief moment of polite hesitation, she agreed, allowing him to fall into step beside her toward the employee parking area. In the parking lot, Malcolm noticed immediately that her car had clearly seen better decades, its paint faded and one hubcap visibly missing, and Simone laughed the observation off good-naturedly, telling him it wasn't pretty, but it reliably got her exactly where she needed to go. Then, after a brief pause that suggested some internal deliberation, she admitted this particular stop wasn't the last one on her evening's agenda. She gestured toward the passenger seat, where several white pharmacy bags sat stacked together, explaining she still needed to drop off medication before finally heading home for the night. When Malcolm asked, carefully, whether someone in her family was unwell, her voice softened in a way he hadn't heard from her before, and she told him about her grandmother, Miss Odessa, the woman who had raised her from childhood after Simone's own parents had passed away far too early. Miss Odessa's health, Simone explained, had been steadily declining for several years now, and she required constant care, careful medication schedules, and near-daily attention that Simone provided almost entirely by herself, without any real support system to lean on. When Malcolm gently asked whether she had any help managing all of this responsibility, Simone only offered a small, tired smile and said they would be fine, the same reassurance she likely repeated to herself more often than she cared to admit. That night, long after he had returned to his own quiet apartment, Malcolm found himself unable to stop thinking about her, a woman who worked harder than nearly anyone else inside that entire office, who carried mounting medical bills and endless exhausting nights without a single word of complaint, while employees earning nearly twice her modest salary spent their days grumbling over the most trivial inconveniences imaginable. For the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, Malcolm found himself genuinely, deeply moved by another person, not because of her physical beauty, though she certainly possessed that in abundance, but because of the rare and quiet strength she seemed to carry inside her without ever asking for recognition or sympathy in return. Meanwhile, entirely unnoticed by either of them in that moment, Someone else inside Ashworth Global had begun paying much closer attention to the pair. Camille Ford had initially found Malcolm mildly amusing, nothing more than the harmless security guard she occasionally mocked for her own entertainment during otherwise dull mornings. But as the weeks continued passing, she noticed something that genuinely unsettled her. Simone seemed authentically, unmistakably happy whenever she was near him. And stranger still, Malcolm appeared entirely uninterested in every single woman who attempted to catch his attention throughout the building, herself included, despite her considerable and usually reliable efforts. That reality bothered Camille far more than she was willing to admit even to herself, because men typically noticed her first. Men typically pursued her without hesitation. And yet this quiet, unremarkable security guard barely acknowledged her presence at all, no matter how deliberately she positioned herself in his path each morning. Her pride simply couldn't accept this quiet rejection, and somewhere beneath her carefully maintained composure, she decided, almost without fully realizing it, that something about this situation needed to change. What Camille didn't yet understand was that fate itself was quietly preparing a revelation so profoundly shocking that it would eventually leave everyone inside Ashworth Global questioning absolutely everything they believed they understood about the quiet man standing at the front door each morning. In the days that followed, Camille found herself watching Malcolm with a different kind of attention altogether, no longer simply dismissive, but now genuinely curious, in a way that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She began noticing small things she had overlooked entirely during the previous weeks: the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself, despite the modest uniform, the careful way he chose his words, even when responding to the rudest of employees, the fact that he never once raised his voice, no matter how thoroughly he was disrespected. None of it made sense to her yet, but something about him refused to fit neatly into the box she had originally placed him in, and that inconsistency bothered her far more than she expected it to. She mentioned her growing curiosity once to a coworker over lunch, describing Malcolm as strange, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, too composed for someone doing menial work, too observant for someone whose job required so little thought. Her coworker laughed the comment off, suggesting perhaps he simply had nowhere better to be, but Camille wasn't entirely convinced by that explanation. She found herself lingering near the lobby longer than necessary some mornings, watching the way Simone and Malcolm interacted, with an ease that seemed to belong to people who had known each other far longer than a few months. It irritated her in a way she couldn't quite name, this quiet intimacy between two people who, by every measure she understood, shouldn't have had anything meaningful to offer one another at all. Meanwhile, life inside Ashworth Global continued at its usual demanding pace, deadlines arriving and departing, departments competing quietly for resources and recognition, executives maneuvering carefully around one another in ways that rarely made the news but shaped nearly every decision made above the lobby floor. Malcolm observed all of it with the patience of someone who had nowhere else he needed to be, cataloguing quietly which managers praised their teams publicly and which ones took credit privately, which employees stayed late to help a struggling coworker, and which ones vanished the moment the clock struck 5. It was, in its own strange way, the most valuable education he had ever received, considerably more useful than anything taught inside the walls of his expensive university. As the weeks steadily turned into months, Malcolm found himself thinking about Simone far more consistently than he had ever anticipated when this entire strange experiment first began. What had started as simple, unremarkable lunchtime conversation had slowly, almost imperceptibly, grown into a genuine friendship, built on honesty, and an ease neither of them had expected to find, inside a workplace defined mostly by quiet competition and unspoken hierarchy. For the first time in longer than he could comfortably remember, Malcolm found himself looking forward to each new day standing at Ashworth Global's entrance, uniform and all, simply because it meant another opportunity to see her smile at him across the lobby. No matter how difficult things became in her own life outside those glass doors, Simone carried herself with a quiet, unwavering strength that never seemed to falter, at least not where others could see it. She never complained about her circumstances, not the mounting bills or the exhausting schedule, and she never spoke poorly of anyone, even those who had clearly wronged her in small, forgettable ways throughout her time at the company. She never allowed bitterness to take root inside her, no matter how physically and emotionally exhausted she became by the end of a long week. Even after her longest, most draining days, she still somehow found the energy to make the people around her feel genuinely seen and valued, a quality Malcolm had rarely encountered in all his years surrounded by wealth, privilege, and the kind of transactional relationships that came with both. One particular evening, Malcolm noticed Simone struggling to start her car inside the employee parking garage, the engine coughing weakly, before finally catching on what sounded like the fourth or fifth attempt. When he walked over to check whether everything was all right, she laughed the moment off, joking that she and her old car were simply having another one of their ongoing disagreements. Though the engine eventually turned over, Malcolm sensed something deeper troubling her that particular evening, something she wasn't quite ready to put into words yet. The following afternoon, during what had become their regular lunch break together in the corner of the lobby, Simone received a phone call that visibly drained the color from her face within seconds of answering. She explained hurriedly that her grandmother wasn't feeling well, gathering her things with trembling hands as she prepared to rush out of the building, and without a moment's hesitation, Malcolm offered to drive her there himself, insisting quietly that it was absolutely no inconvenience despite her initial protests. 20 minutes later, they arrived together at a modest, well-kept home tucked inside a quiet Atlanta neighborhood, where Miss Odessa sat comfortably in her recliner, visibly weak but smiling warmly the very moment she caught sight of her granddaughter walking through the front door. Miss Odessa noticed Malcolm standing near the doorway almost immediately, teasing Simone good-naturedly about the handsome young man she had apparently brought along with her, and the three of them shared a brief, genuine laugh that eased some of the tension still lingering in the room. Over the following hour, Malcolm quietly observed Simone preparing a simple dinner, carefully organizing her grandmother's medication into the correct compartments, and tending to Miss Odessa with a patience and gentleness that moved him considerably more than he had expected walking in. Nothing about her kindness in that home felt performed or obligatory in any way. It was simply, unmistakably who she was when nobody was asking her to be anything else, when no audience existed to witness or applaud her efforts. Before they left that evening, Miss Odessa quietly pulled Malcolm aside near the front door, telling him plainly and without hesitation that Simone had spent her entire life taking care of everyone around her, and that she deserved, more than almost anyone Miss Odessa had ever known, someone who would finally take care of her in return. Malcolm told her, with complete sincerity, that he believed she was right, and those words remained with him throughout the quiet drive back toward Ashworth Global. From that night forward, Malcolm's feelings towards Simone only continued deepening, though he constantly reminded himself of an uncomfortable truth lingering beneath their growing closeness. She had fallen for a man she genuinely believed worked security for a modest hourly wage, not the heir to one of Atlanta's most successful companies. Strangely, rather than complicating his feelings, this reality made her affection feel considerably more valuable to him than anything his family's considerable fortune had ever managed to purchase. Meanwhile, Camille Ford remained exactly as arrogant as she had always been, though lately something had begun bothering her far more deeply than she cared to acknowledge, and that something was Simone. It wasn't professional rivalry exactly, since Simone never competed for attention the way Camille instinctively did in every room she entered. It was, instead, the effortless way people seemed genuinely drawn to Simone without her ever actively trying to earn that attention, and Camille secretly resented this quality more than she would ever admit aloud. What bothered her most severely of all was watching Simone and Malcolm laugh together near the lobby entrance nearly every single morning, their easy familiarity evident to anyone paying even the slightest attention. One particular day, standing with several co-workers near the entrance, Camille made a cutting remark about their little Cinderella apparently finding her prince, and the small group surrounding her laughed obligingly along with her, the way people often do when they haven't fully considered the cruelty embedded in a joke. Simone overheard the comment clearly, and rather than reacting with anger or embarrassment, she simply told Camille that what someone did for a living had absolutely nothing to do with determining their fundamental worth as a person, adding calmly, almost gently, That character mattered considerably more than any title ever could. Her measured response only irritated Camille further, because deep down, in a place she rarely allowed herself to examine too closely, she genuinely couldn't understand why someone as intelligent and composed as Simone would waste her time and attention on a man she privately considered beneath her own social standing. A few days later, Malcolm received an unexpected phone call from his mother asking him to come to her office the following evening, and when he arrived after most employees had already gone home for the night, they spent nearly an hour discussing everything he had witnessed so far during his time undercover. The arrogance he'd encountered, the quiet, unexpected kindness, the people who abused what little authority they held over others, and the ones who consistently treated every person around them with genuine, unwavering dignity. Regina listened carefully to every single word her son offered, nodding occasionally, before finally telling him that the truth about people always revealed itself the moment they believed nobody of any real importance was watching their behavior. Just as their conversation was drawing to its natural close, neither of them noticed that Camille, having forgotten her purse in her office earlier that afternoon, had returned to retrieve it and now stood just outside the partially open office door, close enough to see everything unfolding inside. Through the narrow gap, she watched in stunned, frozen silence as Regina Ashworth, the most powerful and respected woman in the entire company, embraced the security guard warmly and told him, with unmistakable pride in her voice, that she was proud of him, referring to him unmistakably as her son. Camille's blood ran cold in that instant as the scattered pieces of the past several months finally fell into place inside her mind. In that single, devastating moment, everything she believed she understood about Malcolm shattered completely and irreversibly. The man she had mocked and dismissed for months without a second thought was, in fact, the future of Ashworth Global itself. And rather than feeling any genuine shame for how cruelly she had treated him during that time, an entirely different emotion began quietly taking root inside her chest instead, one that would soon set into motion a painful and far-reaching chain of events neither Malcolm nor Simone could have possibly anticipated. Camille barely slept at all that night, her mind consumed entirely by the staggering discovery she had made outside Regina's office door. The security guard she had spent the better part of 3 months mocking wasn't merely another replaceable employee. He was the only son of Regina Ashworth herself, and by the time morning arrived, she had already convinced herself that this revelation changed absolutely everything about her own future prospects at the company. She arrived at Ashworth Global that morning with a plan already forming clearly in her mind, greeting Malcolm with a warmth she had never once shown him during their previous months of interaction, bringing him coffee unprompted, and complimenting him openly in front of anyone within earshot who might happen to notice her sudden change in demeanor. Malcolm accepted her newfound kindness politely enough on the surface, though something about the sudden shift felt immediately hollow and calculated to him. After months spent quietly studying exactly how people behaved when they wanted something badly enough, recognizing insincerity had become almost second nature to him by this point. Simone noticed the dramatic change in Camille's behavior as well, and though she genuinely tried not to dwell on it too heavily, she felt something unfamiliar and unwelcome creeping quietly into her chest, a jealousy she wasn't particularly proud of experiencing. She told herself firmly that Malcolm deserved to be happy with whoever he ultimately chose to be with, and rather than compete openly for his attention the way Camille clearly intended to, she began slowly creating distance between them instead, shortening their once easy conversations and quietly skipping their usual shared lunches in the lobby corner. Malcolm noticed the shift almost immediately, and when he finally managed to catch up with her privately near the elevator bank to ask directly if something had changed between them, Simone admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she assumed Camille was genuinely interested in pursuing him and didn't want to complicate matters unnecessarily between the three of them. Before Malcolm could properly correct her assumption, the elevator doors slid open, and she disappeared inside without another word, leaving him standing there, replaying the unmistakable sadness in her expression for the remainder of that entire day. Meanwhile, Camille grew considerably more aggressive in her pursuit as the days passed, showering Malcolm with increasingly extravagant gifts and making absolutely certain her attention toward him remained visible to the entire office, though no matter how determinedly she tried, he remained noticeably distant and entirely unmoved by her efforts. What Camille didn't know, and couldn't possibly have known, was that Regina had been quietly observing every single employee inside Ashworth Global for months now, and lately, her careful attention had settled increasingly on Simone Bell specifically, a woman who had absolutely no idea who Malcolm truly was, which meant that every single act of kindness she extended toward him came from an entirely honest and uncalculated place. One particular evening, Regina invited Simone up to her office directly, and for nearly 30 uninterrupted minutes, the two women spoke not about quarterly reports or departmental performance, but about life itself, about family, about sacrifice, and about the quiet burdens Simone carried without ever complaining to anyone around her. Regina eventually asked, almost casually, what Simone thought of the young man currently working security downstairs, and Simone answered, without a single moment's hesitation, that he was a genuinely good man, kind even toward people who clearly didn't deserve his kindness in return, and that his fundamental character would remain entirely unchanged regardless of how much money he possessed or didn't possess. Downstairs, meanwhile, Malcolm's mounting problems with Camille finally reached a breaking point when she announced casually to several co-workers gathered near the break room that the two of them had secretly been seeing each other for weeks, and rumors spread rapidly throughout Ashworth Global almost overnight, reaching nearly every department by the following afternoon. Malcolm denied the rumor firmly, and immediately the moment he became aware of it, but the damage had already been thoroughly done by that point, spreading faster than any correction could possibly travel. Standing nearby, entirely unnoticed during this exchange, Simone overheard everything unfold in real time, and quietly convinced herself that whatever feelings she had allowed herself to develop for Malcolm simply no longer mattered given this new revelation. She began drafting her formal resignation letter that same difficult week, utterly exhausted by mounting medical bills for her grandmother, Miss Odessa's steadily declining health, and a heart she no longer felt she could fully trust to guide her decisions. Through a trusted executive assistant, Regina learned of Simone's quiet plans to resign from the company entirely, and immediately called Malcolm into her office, sliding the completed resignation letter across her desk toward him, and telling him plainly, without any room for misinterpretation, that if he genuinely intended to do something meaningful about his feelings for this woman, the time to act had arrived, and there was no reasonable excuse remaining for further delay. That same difficult week, Malcolm happened to overhear Camille speaking on the phone with a friend near the break room, laughing carelessly about never having to work another day in her life once she married into the Ashworth family, and for the first time since beginning his entire experiment, genuine disappointment settled heavily over him, rather than anger. The woman who had spent weeks chasing his attention had never once cared about who he actually was as a person. She had only ever cared about what his name and fortune represented, and that painful realization made his feelings for Simone considerably clearer than they had ever been before. Later that same evening, after a sudden summer storm rolled violently through the city and Simone's aging car finally gave out for good in the middle of rush-hour traffic, she found herself sitting alone at a covered bus stop, soaked through, exhausted, and quietly resigned to walking away from everything she had built at Ashworth Global without saying a proper goodbye to anyone. She never expected the next person to settle onto the bench beside her would be Malcolm, and this time he had absolutely no intention of allowing her to simply disappear from his life without a fight. He sat down beside her without any hesitation at all, the rain still falling steadily around the small shelter, and gently asked why she had planned to leave the company without saying anything to him directly first. Simone admitted through tears that she had convinced herself distancing was easier for everyone involved, especially for him, given everything happening with Camille and the rumors spreading through the office. Malcolm asked her plainly, his voice steady despite the storm around them, why she kept insisting on deciding what he supposedly deserved, reminding her gently that he had never once cared about status, or money, or impressing anyone who happened to be watching. Simone finally admitted the truth she had been avoiding for weeks, that she was simply scared of loving someone deeply and then losing them entirely, the way she had already lost so much throughout her life. Malcolm confessed, quietly and without hesitation, that he felt exactly the same fear settling in his own chest, and as the rain continued falling steadily around them, he removed his jacket and placed it gently over her shoulders, telling her he didn't know exactly what tomorrow held for either of them, but he knew with absolute certainty that he didn't want to lose her from his life. Neither of them noticed Regina Ashworth watching quietly from a nearby shelter across the street, smiling to herself before boarding her own bus home, grateful beyond words to finally witness her son experiencing genuine, uncomplicated happiness for the first time since his father had passed away years earlier. The following morning, Malcolm arrived at Ashworth Global, feeling lighter than he had felt in years. Though Camille, still convinced entirely that his improved mood had everything to do with her, decided it was finally time to make her intentions known publicly to the entire office. When she approached him confidently in front of several co-workers near the lobby, implying that their relationship was already understood and accepted by everyone around them, Malcolm corrected her clearly and firmly in front of the gathered witnesses, stating that they had never been together in any capacity and that he had never given her a single reason to believe otherwise. Humiliated thoroughly in front of the entire office, Camille's carefully maintained pride shattered completely in that moment, and rather than accepting the painful truth gracefully, resentment began taking deep root inside her chest instead. That evening, sitting alone inside her apartment, replaying the humiliation over and over in her mind, she remembered suddenly the photographs she had secretly taken of Malcolm embracing Regina weeks earlier, and decided, with cold clarity, that if she couldn't have him for herself, she would use his closely guarded secret to destroy the woman who ultimately had won his affection instead. The following morning, anonymous emails containing those exact photographs spread rapidly throughout Ashworth Global, sparking widespread confusion and wild speculation across nearly every department within hours, though nobody among the confused employees guessed anywhere close to the actual truth behind the images. Regina remained entirely calm, despite her executives' visible panic surrounding the leak, telling them plainly that the truth always arrived exactly when it was meant to arrive, not a moment sooner or later. Later that same day, she informed Malcolm privately that his 12 weeks undercover were now officially complete, handing him a thick folder containing everything he had documented and learned about the people running his own family's company. Meanwhile, Simone was summoned upstairs unexpectedly, where Regina asked her directly and without preamble whether her feelings for Malcolm would change in any meaningful way if he turned out to be a billionaire rather than a security guard. Simone answered without a single moment's hesitation that she would still see only Malcolm, the same man who consistently forgot where he had left his coffee cup and ate his sandwiches far too quickly during their shared lunches. Before Regina could respond further, her assistant rushed urgently into the office to inform her that the leaked rumors had now reached members of the local press, and Regina calmly declared, without a trace of panic in her voice, that it was finally time for the entire truth to come out. Within the hour, an emergency company-wide meeting was called throughout every department at Ashworth Global, and hundreds of employees filled the auditorium, uncertain of what to expect from the sudden announcement. Some quietly fearing layoffs, others whispering nervously about a possible corporate restructuring. Camille sat confidently near the front row of the gathered crowd, still certain that whatever happened next, her privileged knowledge of Malcolm's true identity would somehow work decisively in her favor. Simone took a seat quietly near the back of the auditorium instead, hoping only that nothing troubling had happened to Malcolm personally, entirely unaware of the sweeping revelation about to unfold in front of the assembled company. Regina walked onto the small stage at the front of the auditorium and addressed the packed room directly, explaining calmly that for the past 12 weeks, she had conducted a careful experiment designed to answer one essential question that had troubled her for years, namely, who people truly were when they genuinely believed nobody of any real importance was watching their behavior. She called Malcolm forward from the side of the stage, and audible gasps filled the auditorium as the security guard so many employees recognized instantly walked toward the podium, dressed not in his familiar uniform, but in a tailored navy suit befitting the future leader of the entire company. Regina introduced her only son as the next chief executive officer of Ashworth Global, and the room erupted immediately into a chaotic mixture of disbelief, scattered whispers, and quiet tears, with Camille's previously confident smile fading instantly the moment she realized Malcolm hadn't looked in her direction even once since walking onto that stage. Regina continued speaking steadily, explaining to the stunned room that during her son's extended time undercover, some employees had demonstrated genuine compassion and unwavering integrity, while others had revealed troubling arrogance and casual disrespect toward those they considered beneath their attention. She promised the assembled company that character would now matter considerably more than title inside Ashworth Global moving forward. She then turned her attention deliberately toward the back rows of the auditorium, describing a woman who had cared faithfully for her ailing grandmother while working tirelessly throughout each demanding week, treating every single person she encountered with equal, unwavering respect, regardless of what she believed their position or status to be. Every eye in that crowded auditorium slowly turned toward Simone, whose cheeks flushed a deep crimson as Regina called her name directly and asked her to please join them both on the stage. With visibly trembling hands, Simone rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the front of the auditorium, and when she finally reached Malcolm's side, the surrounding noise of hundreds of watching employees seemed to fade away entirely for both of them, leaving only the two of them standing together in that suspended moment. Malcolm spoke next, his voice carrying clearly across the silent auditorium, telling the assembled room that during his time undercover, he had witnessed both genuine cruelty and unexpected kindness in equal measure, but that one particular person had reminded him powerfully what actually mattered most in life. He told Simone directly, in front of everyone gathered there, that when everyone else in that building had seen only a security guard standing at the entrance, she alone had seen a complete human being, that she had shared her lunch with him without hesitation and treated him with genuine dignity when she firmly believed he possessed nothing of material value at all, and that somewhere along the way during their months of quiet friendship, he had fallen completely in love with her. The auditorium erupted into thunderous applause as Simone covered her mouth in stunned shock, tears already streaming freely down her face, while Camille sat frozen in her seat, watching helplessly as the future she had spent weeks imagining for herself collapsed entirely in front of hundreds of witnesses. Regina then addressed the leaked rumors and photographs directly, confirming publicly that confidential company information had been deliberately exposed by someone within the organization, and called Camille Ford by name in front of the entire assembled company. Trembling visibly now, Camille listened as Regina expressed her genuine disappointment, reminding her firmly that she had been given every reasonable opportunity throughout her employment to demonstrate real integrity, and had instead chosen jealousy and calculated manipulation when faced with rejection. Before Regina could finish delivering her intended consequences, Malcolm stepped forward unexpectedly and asked his mother quietly to show mercy in this particular situation, stating plainly that he had absolutely no interest in seeking revenge against Camille, only in her someday coming to understand that genuine love could never be purchased or manufactured through manipulation. Camille broke down crying openly in front of the gathered crowd, not because she had lost any chance with Malcolm specifically, but because for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, she truly saw herself clearly, and didn't particularly like what that reflection revealed about her own character. Regina terminated her employment, effective immediately following the meeting, and as Camille walked slowly toward the auditorium exit, she paused briefly to offer a quiet apology to Simone, who simply told her, without any trace of lingering resentment, that she forgave her completely. As Camille disappeared through the auditorium doors, a heavy silence settled briefly over the room before Regina addressed the remaining crowd once more, her tone considerably gentler now than it had been moments earlier. She reminded everyone gathered that this experiment had never been designed to punish anyone, but rather to reveal something true about the culture they had all built together, whether they realized it or not. She spoke of the janitor who had worked the night shift for nearly 11 years without a single complaint, receiving a long overdue promotion that afternoon, along with tears of gratitude from co-workers who admitted they had never once learned his name. She spoke of a young receptionist who had quietly covered shifts for a grieving co-worker without ever mentioning it to anyone, and who now stood blushing near the front row as her name was read aloud to enthusiastic applause. Several managers throughout the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Regina continued, aware that their own conduct over recent months might not have reflected the values she was now describing so clearly. She made no additional examples of them publicly, choosing instead to address those conversations privately in the days that followed. But the message had already landed clearly enough for anyone paying attention. Malcolm watched his mother command the room with the same quiet authority she had shown him his entire life, and found himself feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely proud to eventually inherit the responsibility she had built from nothing. As the auditorium gradually settled following Camille's departure, Regina turned back toward her son, with a knowing smile spreading across her face, reminding him gently that there remained one more thing he had apparently promised to do before this experiment officially concluded. The entire room immediately sensed what was coming next, a wave of anticipation rippling through the gathered employees. Malcolm laughed nervously under his breath before taking a slow, deliberate breath and turning fully to face Simone, lowering himself onto one knee directly in front of the entire assembled company, without a moment's further hesitation. Gasps echoed loudly throughout the auditorium as Simone covered her mouth in complete disbelief, tears already filling her wide eyes. Malcolm told her, his voice carrying steadily despite the obvious emotion behind it, that he had begun this entire journey searching only for the truth about the people around him, but had found something far greater than he ever anticipated instead. A woman who had loved him completely when she believed he possessed absolutely nothing of material value, who had reminded him that genuine kindness still existed unconditionally in this world, and who he could no longer possibly imagine building his future without. He opened a small velvet box slowly, revealing a breathtaking diamond ring inside, and asked Simone Bell directly whether she would do him the profound honor of becoming his wife. Simone could barely manage to speak through her overwhelming tears, laughing and crying simultaneously, before finally nodding her head firmly, and the entire auditorium erupted into joyous celebration, with employees embracing one another spontaneously, as even the most reserved executives found themselves cheering enthusiastically, like excited children. Miles away across the city, Miss Odessa watched the entire emotional moment unfold live on a streaming broadcast from her living room recliner, tears rolling steadily down her weathered cheeks as she whispered a quiet, heartfelt prayer of gratitude toward the ceiling above her. In the weeks that followed this dramatic company meeting, Ashworth Global felt like an entirely different workplace altogether, with employees treating one another noticeably more gently and with considerably more patience than before, almost as though the entire building had collectively absorbed the powerful lesson Regina's 12-week experiment had been specifically designed to teach everyone involved. Malcolm no longer stood dutifully by the front entrance each morning holding the door for arriving employees, though sometimes, when the mood struck him unexpectedly, he still walked quietly past that same entrance, simply to remember exactly where everything meaningful in his life had truly begun. The wedding itself took place several months later in a beautifully arranged garden overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline, with white flowers lining the entire aisle and soft music filling the warm evening air as guests arrived. Every former employee of Ashworth Global received a genuine invitation to attend, including those who had made significant mistakes during Regina's experiment, because Malcolm and Simone had both agreed firmly on one guiding principle together, that people fundamentally deserved genuine chances to grow and change from their past behavior. Simone stood quietly before the ceremony, holding her grandmother's frail hand tightly in her own, with Miss Odessa telling her granddaughter through happy tears that she looked absolutely like an angel standing there in her wedding dress, and Simone reminding her grandmother gently that she was the entire reason Simone had become the woman she was today. Across the garden, Malcolm stood beside his mother, who told him quietly and with obvious pride that he had learned from the very best example available to him. As the ceremony was about to formally begin, a quiet, unexpected commotion rippled through the assembled crowd near the garden's entrance. Camille Ford stood at the edge of the gathering, dressed simply now and carrying none of the practiced arrogance she had once worn so effortlessly during her time at the company, and she apologized softly for arriving completely uninvited before thanking Simone sincerely for teaching her something profound about genuine love and authentic kindness that she should have understood long before that painful day in the auditorium. Simone stepped forward without hesitation and embraced her warmly, offering closure rather than lingering resentment, and Camille thanked her quietly one final time before turning and walking away in genuine peace, rather than lingering shame. The ceremony continued uninterrupted from that point forward, and when Malcolm and Simone were finally pronounced husband and wife in front of their assembled friends and family, the entire garden rose together in enthusiastic applause. Later that same evening, standing together quietly, overlooking the glittering city skyline in comfortable stillness, Simone asked Malcolm softly whether he believed everything had truly happened exactly the way it was always supposed to happen between them. Malcolm considered the question thoughtfully for a long moment, before smiling and telling her that he genuinely believed they had both been exactly where they needed to be at exactly the right moment in order to find one another. Somewhere out in this vast world, people continue judging one another by titles, appearances, and inherited status, but Malcolm and Simone's story reminds us of something simple, yet undeniably powerful. The way you treat people when you sincerely believe nobody important is watching is truly who you are underneath everything else, and genuine love, when it's real, always finds its way home in the end.